There's a big BRICS summit in Russia where they had representatives from many of the different BRICS nations. I know Xi Jinping was there. I know the South African president was there, but even the UN ambassador was there. And I don't know if you saw, I mean, the UN General Director, Guterres, was there. I don't know if you guys saw him, but there he was. And he was also over there at the BRICS Summit taking these pictures with this man who's currently wanted for kidnapping and trafficking Ukrainian children before brainwashing them to think that they're Russian. And that is what they're doing. They're trying to propagandize them to think that they're Russian. You know, just meeting the foreign minister Lavrov and eating cake and just having like a grand old time. Anyway, Steve Rosenberg was at this summit. Now, if you're curious what Gutierrez says to say why he went there, he says that he has to engage with BRICS considering how much of the world's population it represents, and it's like a good pathway to peace. Why he didn't go to the Ukraine Peace Summit, if you're willing to go to BRICS, might be willing to go to the Ukraine Peace Summit, but now he's pissed off the Ukrainians so much that now he's asked to go to Ukraine after going to BRICS, maybe to like, oh, I don't like how this is being received amongst Ukrainians. Maybe I should go to Ukraine and try to polish up my image. No, they're not having that. I don't know if you guys saw that, but Zelensky actually rejected the Secretary General's attempted visit over to Ukraine due to him going to Russia for the BRICS Summit, because the Ukrainian government is still of the position of isolate the Russians, isolate the Russians, isolate the Russians. I think the UN has come into the position that the Russians are not isolated, so let's not act as if they are isolated. Anyway, Steve Rosenberg, one of the few journalists still in Russia today that I think is doing a good job. He's a reporter with the BBC. He does a lot of reporting on Russian media and how it's talking to the domestic Russian audience. And I watch enough of DylanBurnsLIVE Live and these other Russian programs, and I see those, but I don't read the newspapers. And what I always appreciate about Steve Rosenberg is I'm going into the newspapers, going through all these crazy editorials and seeing what the state line is and seeing what is being permissible, what's allowed to be published if there's any inner critique made. So, sorry, there is an air raid alert right now, and those are jets. I'm gonna close the window. Anyway, let's listen to what Steve Rosenberg had to say to Vladimir Putin, because this is the first time since the start of the war Rosenberg has been able to interview Putin, because he has been quite closed off from the press. But I think he's using the BRICS event to try to, go on a Russian PR offensive. Now the final question today. I'd like to give it to the BBC. That is Dmitry Peskov. That is Putin's press secretary. A rare guest these days, Steve Rosenberg.
BBC,
the BBC, the one in the hat. Please. I read the final declaration of the BRICS Summit. It talks about the need for global and regional stability and security in a fair world. And the motto of the Russian BRICS presidency includes these ideas of fairness and security. But what does that have in common with your actions over the last 2.5 years with the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Where are the fairness, stability, and security here? Including Russia's security. Because before the start of the Russian military operation, there were no drone attacks on Russian territory, no shelling of Russian towns, and no foreign troops occupying Russian territory. There was none of this. And finally, how does that match up with the recent statements by British intelligence that Russia aims to spread chaos on the streets of Britain and Europe through arson and acts of sabotage and so on? Where's the stability here? Thank you. If you see at the end of that, Putin starts laughing, and you can see he's writing down. He's like he's in class. He's in school again. He's writing down every note. Ah, man, he's like on the hippy dippy. He's on the panel show. He doesn't want to get muted by the moderator. Let me start. By the way, all of these are great points. We started the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a special military operation for Russia's security. Number one, to protect the Russian-speaking peoples, even though now more Russian-speaking peoples are dead than ever. Many more of them have been bombed. Many of their towns, cities, and villages have been blown up to smithereens, some to such a point that the Russians even admit that rebuilding them is a fool's errand, like what they said with Popasna, which is that they're not even going to rebuild it after capturing it. So Russian-speaking towns destroyed, Russian-speaking cities destroyed, and Russian speakers are the ones, when you look at the civilian population, that are dying overwhelmingly because this is where the fighting is concentrated. Okay, well, at least they're here to fight Nazism. Oh, wait a second. We gave Rusich and a bunch of prison neo-Nazis guns and we sent them into Ukraine. Maybe this doesn't have much to do with that. Well, you know, at least we stopped the expansion of NATO. Oh, wait, Sweden and Finland. And now not only has NATO expanded, but now NATO's border with Russia has more than doubled. And now NATO is an organization of over 1 billion people altogether. Well, what about Russia's security? Well, now Russia's been invaded. Part of Russia's being occupied, and he said the rest. So when you pitch this war as enhancing Russia's security, it's not such a straightforward victory, especially since Russia has other security problems. Its soldiers getting ambushed in Mali, the terror attacks in Moscow and that mall, or the terror attacks down in the Caucasus. There was just an ambush, and I didn't cover it on stream, but there were some Russian soldiers driving in the Caucasus that just got ambushed. 3 of them, just somebody jumps in the road, mows them down. They have no clue who did it or why they did it or anything. It just happened. Like, these are other security issues that the Russians have. Let's say that there's new protests in Kazakhstan because they're not able to continue fuel subsidies, like the protests before. Before they had troops to send over there. Do they have the troops to send over there now? And if they do have troops to send over there, what are going to be the quality of those troops if they actually have to be engaged with? Because it's not like it's impossible for anyone to build up the courage to engage the Russian army. The Ukrainians are doing that right now. Point is, selling this from an angle of Russian security is not that simple. So that's on the security front. The stability front, that's clear enough. It had an impact on world fuel markets, it had an impact on the Russian fuel market, it had an impact on Russian inflation, it had an impact on global inflation rates, it had an impact on the amount of displaced people, it had an impact on these arson attacks and other things that he's talking about, like Steve Rosenberg, the different sabotage attacks, like the planned sabotage attack of Polish rail line into Ukraine, the planned sabotage attack of American military bases in Germany, the planned sabotage attack of facilities in the Baltics, the arson attacks in the United Kingdom. So, I mean, I think, honestly, this is a very tough and straightforward and good question from Steve Rosenberg, which, I mean, I would expect of him. Let's see what Putin has to say in response. Let me start with Russia's security, because for me that's the priority. You mentioned drone attacks and so on. Yes, this didn't happen before, but the situation was far worse. The situation was like this. In response to our constant, persistent proposals to develop contacts and relations with countries of the Western world, they always tried to put us in our place. I can tell you that for sure. On the surface, it was all very friendly, but in fact, they always tried to put us in our place. Always from this place. And from this place,
corrupt, bankrupt man. Burns is an immoral, morally corrupt, bankrupt man.
But in fact, they always tried to put us in our place. And from this place, Russia would have ended up being reduced to the status of a second-class state, whose sole function is supplier of raw materials, resulting to a large extent in the loss of our country's sovereignty. In that condition, Russia is not only unable to develop, it cannot exist. Russia cannot exist if it loses its sovereignty. That's the key point. To be clear, what he's saying that in order for Russia to have its sovereignty, it has to trample on Ukrainian sovereignty. To be clear, but this to me, this is all diluted. Sanki, thank you so much for the tier for the gifted sub. I appreciate that. This is diluted to me, and it's diluted for a few reasons. Okay, number one, we don't want to become just a raw resource exporter. This war has sped up that process. There's a bunch of businesses in the tech sector that pulled out because of the war. There are a bunch of workers that fled the country because they were no longer going to be able to work in those tech sectors. There are others that fled the country not only because they wouldn't be able to work in the tech sector and higher earning service economies, or service jobs or jobs in the tech sector, they also left because they didn't want to be drafted. They also left because the state became more repressive, not only of speech and of the press, but of really any type of internal critique of grandpa. And so you lost a lot of this high value labor. And not only did you lose that high value labor, but those who are most loyal to Russia and actually answered the call of the draft or answered the call for service, those are the ones getting grinded up in Ukraine right now. And this is already on top of the demographic crisis that Russia had before they even engaged in this war. So you're getting rid and you're scaring away your higher tech working class of people in your country. You're grinding down the manpower you do have in an offensive war in a manner that is going to come with undoubtedly high casualties, and there's no way to avoid the high casualties when you've already moved, when you are trying to move away from the demographic crisis that Russia has been trapped in since the end of the Soviet Union. Like, for me, I do not see how this is the pathway to not just being a resource exporter. In fact, if you go to the Chinese, what is the Russians right now? A cheap resource exporter, because the Europeans won't buy their product anymore. So now they have to sell their product to the Chinese at a major discount. Same thing with the Indians as well. And let me ask you, why is it that the Russians are violating the OPEC export restrictions, that they're violating so much that it's pissing off the Saudis to the point where they're just going to say, screw the restrictions. They just want to grab up market share, which could then bring down the price of oil and gas. And if it does, what does that mean for the Russian war economy? What does that mean for the Russian budget? Does freezing investments in infrastructure, freezing and investments in social services, does this help move away from becoming a criminal mafia petrol state? I just don't see how making your military reliant on North Korean imports is moving you away from being, well, as the international community, or at least commentators have said before, a gas station with atomic weapons. Like, I don't see how this achieves that goal.
Выход России из этого состояния.
And getting Russia out of this, like, you can't just conquer your way out of that position.
Вот в этом самое главное. И выход
And getting
России
Russia
из этого
out of the
состояния,
situation,
укрепление своего
strengthening your sovereignty and
суверенитета,
independence
в экономике,
in the
финансах,
economy,
военном деле,
finances,
и
military
означает
affairs,
повышение нашей
increases our
безопасности.
security,
И означает
and creates
создание
conditions
условий для ее уверенного
for
развития
its
в будущем,
confident
как
development in the
самостоятельного
future
государства,
as an independent state,
полноценного и
fully
самодостаточного,
fledged and self-sufficient,
с теми
with the kind of
партнерами,
partners we have in BRICS,
каких мы имеем в БРИКС, которые
who
уважают
respect Russia's independence,
независимость России, уважают
respect
наши
our
традиции
traditions,
и к которым мы
and whom we treat
относимся таким
likewise.
же образом. Теперь по поводу
Now to the
точки
question
зрения
of security in
безопасности. Что
general.
касается
I've already
безопасности России,
spoken
я
about
уже
Russia's
сказал.
security.
Я понимаю,
I
что
understand what you're saying.
но
But from my view of
справедливо с
security,
точки зрения безопасности годами
it is fair when for
игнорировать
years
наши
our partners
постоянные
ignored our
обращения к
constant
партнерам,
requests
не расширять НАТО
not
на
to
восток.
expand NATO to the
Разве
east.
справедливо
By the way,
в
early 2000s, his position on NATO expansion in Ukraine was that's up to them to decide. That was his position on NATO expansion in Ukraine in the early 2000s. If you don't want NATO to expand, don't give people like the countries like Finland and Sweden a reason to want to run to NATO. If you don't want NATO to expand, negotiate a treaty with the Ukrainians to give them back Crimea for guarantees of the continued preservation of neutrality in the Ukrainian constitution. Like, you got to be able to wheel and deal a little bit here and be able to give a little, take a little. Like, if you want that type of neutrality for the Ukrainians, you don't think the Ukrainians would accept no NATO membership if it meant they got all their land back? That meant that they would have a strong military, but they wouldn't be part of NATO. They wouldn't be part of any bloc. You know, they'd have to stand as some kind of buffer state between these two. You don't think they'd take that deal? I think they would take that deal. And most Ukrainians I've asked about this deal have told me that they would take it. So it's not just about NATO expansion. NATO expansion is one element of it. But I think to just make it NATO expansion, when Putin says that, you know, Russia's control of Ukraine and its ties to Ukraine, and the reason that it owns Ukraine goes back to like Rorik's horse taking a dump back in Kiev in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, who gives a fuck? If it's ideological. He believes that Russia has a right to Ukraine. And he's wrote articles about it, he's made speeches about it. So I don't think that it's just NATO expansion. I don't think it's just NATO expansion. And one way to speed up NATO expansion is to do these types of expansionist wars in Europe.
Нам в лицо, обещая, что такого расширения не
Promising there will be no such expansion, and then do this in violation of your obligations. Is it fair to move right up to our underbelly? For example, in Ukraine. And begin building, not preparing, but already building military bases. Is that fair? Is it fair that there's no NATO military bases in Ukraine? Is it fair to carry out a state coup? That I mentioned in answer to your colleague's question. So the idea that they overthrew the Ukrainian government. Again, the Ukrainians did that, but it has to be the West did it, because if the Ukrainians did it, it's not a war of liberation, it is a war of conquest. Without any concern for international law and all principles of the international law and the UN Charter. Financing a coup in a different country. When people talk about financing a coup, you know what they're talking about? We like paid for like election monitors. We paid for like courses in press freedom. And like these are the coups that we financed. It wasn't like the Russians did, the shipping of weapons to the rapid support forces in Sudan. No, it's not that. You know, it's not like Operation Timber Sycamore, you know, we didn't say, no, it's, we funded NGOs, and that's like us funding a coup. If that is a coup, then the Russians attempted a coup in Moldova just in the last week, through them trying to buy votes and manipulate the election. And pushing the situation towards a hot phase. Is that fair in terms of global security? Is it fair to violate your OSCE obligations when all countries in the West signed a document declaring that you cannot have security for one country if it violates another country's security?
Have to disagree that these questions are good. Generally speaking, any cue about how's the war going is bad, as it just easily molded into the Putin's narrative. Instead, a cue about mobilized RU could work. Tie for work. Stay safe.
Well, I don't know. I think the question is very simple. Like, hey, you say that this is all for security, but, you know, Russia's getting bombed. Russian cities are occupied. Like, how is Russia safer? And now he's just pivoting to like NATO expansion, right? Which I mean, like, he was going to do that no matter what. But like the idea of, and this is, I think, an appealing message to everyone, like, before the war, we weren't getting bombed. Before the war, there were no Ukrainian troops and holding on to Russian land. Before the war, there were no oil refineries blowing up. Before the war, there was not all these car bombings. Before the war, there were not these sanctions, or not the sanctions, at least being this brutal. Before the, like, I think these are arguments with conviction. I think they have an impact. And I think like throwing that at him in a setting like this, I think is good enough. I don't know, like, there's not a follow-up section. If there's a follow-up section, then obviously I'd want him to keep on the pressure. But I think this is about as much as you're going to do. Like, of course, Putin's going to try to weave it into his own narrative. That's why you just need to bring up inconvenient facts that he hasn't mentioned the drones. He hasn't mentioned the fact that Russian cities are currently under occupation. And he is the first Russian leader since Stalin that has had Russian cities under occupation, right? Under his watch. That is an inconvenient fact. And so he's building his answer around that. So I think your objection is more to the idea of asking him questions in a setting like this, period. Because I don't know of any question you could ask him that Putin's not going to attempt to mold into his own narrative or in his own direction. We said, don't do this. It violates our security. NATO's expansion. By the way, they didn't say that early on. They said this later on. They said this after, like, it was, I think, like in the mid 2000s. Like, not in the early 2000s, not in the late 90s. It was a little bit more divided. Even Putin.
Разве это
They did it all the same. Is that fair?
Никакой справедливости
There's
здесь
nothing
нет.
fair
И мы
here.
хотим поменять эту
And we want to
ситуацию.
change the
И
situation.
мы добьемся
And
этого.
we will.
Последний еще раз.
Can you repeat your last question?
Утверждение британского
About the claims of British intelligence
России вот
that Russia is sowing
хаос,
chaos on the streets of Britain.
Послушайте меня. Это,
Listen.
Спасибо вам
Thank you for reminding
то,
me
что
of
вы
this
напомнили
part.
мне про эту часть. Но это
But it's utter
полная...
nonsense.
Вы понимаете,
You
это
see,
то, что происходит на
happening on the
улицах
streets of
некоторых
certain
европейских
European
городов,
cities
это результат
is a result
внутренней
of domestic
политики
policies
этих
of these
государств.
countries. Okay, that last one is just like, I mean, all of that was insidious, but the last one is particularly insidious because the thing is, the Russians fan the flames of extremists, either far left and far right, because both sides have been indicted in multiple countries in the United States and multiple European countries. They'll fan their flames. And while fanning their flames and like pumping up BLM, pumping up the militia movement, pumping up all these stuff, they are also engaging in sabotage operations throughout Europe. I mean, they've been caught doing it in Poland. They've been caught doing it in Germany. They've been caught doing it in the United Kingdom. They've been caught doing it, I believe, in Canada, even at one point. They've been caught doing it in the Baltic states. They've been caught doing it. They've been caught trying to hire refugees to bomb rail lines. So they're just saying, oh, well, this is your own domestic policies. This is your liberal degeneracy. This is your bad management that are leading to these issues. So that's why these factories are randomly combusting. That's why refugees are being hired to blow up a rail line. It's ridiculous. It's nonsense. It's a diversion. It's trying to pin the chaos that they're trying to sow on domestic concerns. And of course, we have a certain amount of chaos from our domestic situation, but they're currently trying to fan the flames of it. And it's just out and out denial, because obviously if you're out and out saying, yes, I'm trying to cause chaos in your country, then it's going to be harder for those populations to vote against, pushing back against the Russians. The smirk and giggle speaks volumes. It does. I think I mostly think about the utility of the question. Yeah, I guess I don't know how you could get more utility out of a question. Ukraine matters. Also, I just noticed that was Ukraine matters who said that. Thank you very much for stopping by. I don't know if I could ask Putin any question. My question would be, what is the historical significance of you being the first Russian leader since Stalin to have Russian cities occupied under your watch? Like, it would just be but I mean, that question isn't even chosen to what's the most effect? That's like the question chosen to see how much I can piss them off. That's, which I don't know if it's the smartest move, but it is what I want to do. It might not be what the people need or want, but it's what I want, and it's what I need.